Well, hello everyone, and good evening. Thank you for joining us for tonight's discussion. This is the fifth in a series of heritage talks organised by the Exeter Northcote Theatre. And tonight we're going to be talking about the future of the theatre in the context of the theatre's collection of archive material. We're going to be asking, why does it matter to document what the theatre does, what has been collected in the past, and how this can inform plans for the future. And my name's Catherine Johnson. I'm a curator. I started my career back in 2010 in the Theatre and Performance Department of the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, and I'm very pleased that tonight we'll be joined later on in the event by a former colleague of mine, Keith Lodwick, to talk about that theatre collection and its connections to regional collections. I started working with the Northcote earlier this year with the brief to create a digital display of archive material, which resulted in the installation of a large-scale projection mural in the foyer with a digital sequence that now plays before the performance every night. And if anyone listening has seen that, I would love to hear your feedback later on when we get to the Q&A session. I felt when I started working with the archive material that the theatre had such a wonderful character. And really, I think it's the life story of the theatre that's collected in its archive. What we tried to do with the mural was to bring that character into the theatre building itself. As a next phase, we're going to be working or commissioning 2 artists to work further with the archive and create artworks in response to the stories that they find there and in response to the work of the community, which is in Exeter and the local area, who have been running a series of workshops and also taking part in a commissioning circle with me to work on those art pieces. And I'll be joined later on by 2 members of that circle to talk more about that process and their engagement with the archive and what it has meant to them. But our first speaker tonight will be Caroline Walter from the University of Exeter Special Collections, who has been the archivist, conducting the mammoth task of cataloguing the Northcote archive over a period of 2 years, and is now its custodian, and we'll be looking towards the future with her as well. And if it's possible, I'd like to ask Caroline to join the discussion at this point. There she is. Oh, looking very festive, Caroline.
Yes, sorry.
Lovely. You are ahead of us. How are you?
Yeah, it's fine, thanks.
Great. Well, thank you for joining tonight. I know that you've been working with the archive for a long time, but this isn't your first connection to the Northcote, is it?
No, I've actually trodden the board, so to speak, on the stage in a very minor capacity. I was part of Exeter Musical Society's production of Oliver back in 2018, which was great fun. I really, really enjoyed it.
Fantastic. And there might be people listening who were there with you on the stage, perhaps. And could you just start by telling us a little bit about the archive and maybe some of the discoveries that you found in it?
Yes, the archive is, first off, huge. I can't underestimate just how many boxes there were when I first came across it. It is really very large archive. There's 3,000 odd items that have been individually catalogued now. It spans the period of the opening of the Northcote in 1967 up until about 2007, though there are some items later than that. And it's really a mixture of administrative, marketing, publicity, production records throughout the whole period of that time. It's incredibly rich in photographic material, which is brilliant because people love to look back on the performances and they really recognize the staging and the actors. And there's some, incredibly famous faces, obviously, that you can see in the archive very early on in their careers, and they're wonderful to see, as well as also those members of the repertory company who have made their life out of being in, productions at the Northcote and in other regional theatres, and are very well known on the circuit, but perhaps aren't widely known to the public. There's some beautiful things in the archive. I love Nicholas Toyn's photographs. Some of the poster designs and the designs of the programs are incredibly artistic. You can see the impact of different designers over the decades and different design trends that have been taken on. And it's also incredibly strong in terms of the administrative running. So we have board of management minutes, and that tells you exactly what policies the Northcote are thinking of at various times. It shows how they're trying to make theatre for disabled actors. It shows how they're engaging with budget cuts in the sector. It also shows how they're working with other regional theatres and how they're engaging with the community in that area. So there's really something for everybody in the archive.
Yes, and can you tell us the range of people that consult it? Because it sounds as if it's an incredible design resource. It would, I can see the relevance to theatre staff and directors. So who comes to have a look at it?
Anybody, anybody off the street can make an appointment with us and come to see the material in the reading room. At the moment, the main people who consult it are the theatre themselves. They make great use of it through this project. Also, student interns come in to look at the material, and some of our academics are using the material in seminars about the creative industries or about how theatres put on certain productions, so material to do with Shakespeare productions, for example. But also we'll get members of the public come in to look at photographs of a production that they were in. Maybe they were in the Northcote Youth Company or something like that, so they'll reminisce and relive those memories. I would love more of the design feature to be used, and certainly that's something that I think is really, really quite rich. And if there's anyone out there, who's thinking of looking at design in theatre, please come and use the archive.
What are a few of the names in design in the archive? I know Raymond Briggs worked on one production, didn't he?
Yeah, it was his first production in the theatre. He did Toad of Toad Hall, and there's some really lovely costume designs and set designs that he worked on for that production. There's also Kit and Meg Surrey. They're still producing costumes and sets, the Royal Shakespeare Company and various other companies as well. And just all sorts of costume designers, really. A lot of the early productions, the costumes were done in-house, and those costumes can be seen reused sometimes throughout various productions, repurposed and reused. So it's really interesting to see what may have been, Cinderella's dress in one production has become a skirt for a particular, and just a member of the chorus in another production, or some costumes are so obvious that you can see that they've definitely been reused each time and kept as they are.
That's fascinating. So anyone can make an appointment to come and see it in person. Is it also possible to view material online?
There's some material online that the Northcott have been putting out through their heritage section of their website. We're also hoping to put an online exhibition out as part of this project that's being worked on at the moment, though that's not currently available to view. And there's also a few bits that we release through social media on our Twitter feeds and through the Northcott's Twitter feeds, and also through our blog as well.
Fantastic. And if anyone listening were to have pieces that they think could be part of the archive or relate to productions, what would be the process for them to bring those to your attention?
Yep, we'd encourage them to get in touch with ourselves. We're libspc@exeter.ac.uk, or to get in contact through the Northcott box office. They often pass inquiries on to us. And just to let us know what you have, really, because the archive is vast, but we still have gaps within it. So we don't have a complete programme run for the entirety of the time the Northcott's been open. It's almost complete, but we still have some gaps. So what you have at home may well be the missing piece.
And in terms of other material that you would like to have in the archive and perhaps don't?
Yeah. A lot of what's missing in the archive is that backstage element, I think. There's a huge history at the Northcott of nurturing backstage talent. And though we have some material, for example, relating to Maurice Marshall's trainee scheme that he set up, and other training schemes that were that sort of more regular that the Northcott ran, some of the backstage staff can get lost in that. They appear in as names in programs or as a name on the bottom of a set design, but we don't know a huge amount about them. And we don't have a lot of photographs of them often. We've got 2 beautiful photographs of the Northcott workshop as it used to be, and that's really fascinating to see that going on behind the scenes. But there's not a great deal of that kind of backstage material, and that's really nice. And that's also part of what the Northcott's trying to address with oral histories that they're taking of previous staff members.
Great. And will those oral histories come into the archive?
Yes.
So what is your sort of vision of the next 50 years and how the archive will evolve?
Yeah.
It's a big question.
It's a massive question. I suppose the first thing to say is that increasingly the material will be born digital, which provides new and exciting challenges for us. But it's how the theatre is evolving as well as how the archive is evolving. So the context is perfect there. We'd love to retain what we have now and add to it. So to carry on with the runs of programs, to carry on with the runs of Board of Management minutes, and to carry on with the production photographs, to ensure that there is a continuous representation of the Northcott's history there. But that doesn't mean that's all we need. There's areas where we can definitely actively collect to get more representation, particularly perhaps with regards to backstage material and things. And there's also voices that we don't hear represented within the collection, such as voices of actors with a disability, actors of Black actors, LGBTQ actors, and again backstage members of staff and other connections. Some of that will be solved through active collecting, and some of that will be solved by the fact that the Northcott is engaging with those communities more than perhaps it did in the past. Therefore, they will naturally start being represented more within the records.
Can you tell us a bit more about how you think the collecting happened in the past, and perhaps how you found some of the documents when you started working with the archive?
It it seems to have happened fairly haphazardly, particularly in the early years. But that's pretty natural for an archive collection, unless you're you know, a business who keeps the records very completely. When the theatre started out, I'm not sure that the running was as regulated as it is now. So you didn't have necessarily regular board meetings and things like that. And as it goes through, these become more obvious, and the lines of records are more continuous. But what you do get is, what's obviously happened is that certain staff members have identified the importance of these records, and they've collected them. And someone's popped a box under the stairs somewhere, and then we had a set of plans of lighting designs and things like that were found in the lighting box. And the technical director said, "Oh yeah, they've just been there for 20 odd years or so, and we've just left them there. Would you like them?" It's like, yes.
Next to the place where the lighting technicians were working.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
So these things that they tend to develop fairly organically, and for an archive that has come to us in that way, it's surprisingly complete, given there hasn't necessarily been a rigorous collecting policy in place. It was in pretty good condition when it came to us, really. And the theatre were great in terms of packing it up and identifying what they could when it was originally transferred to us. But there's some material that's always more fragile than others, particularly the press cuttings books that we have as part of the collection. Someone has lovingly and painstakingly cut out and sellotaped in cuttings of local and national paper reviews of productions into these gigantic wallpaper albums, sample books. I'm not sure why wallpaper sample books, whether they were something that they had around to do with set design, or whether someone used to work for a wallpaper company, who knows. But they've stuck them in there, and I'm sure they were lovely when they first started. Unfortunately, sellotape and archives just do not go together, and they required a fair amount of stabilization before they could be consulted by the public. But it's absolutely worth it, even though it was a slightly painstaking and annoying process, because they're one of the great resources of the collection, in that they give a beautiful overview of not only the productions at the Northcott, but the different news articles of the day to do with theatre and to do with the region. So you can follow the sort of trials and tribulations of funding of arts in the Southwest through these press cuttings, and you can see how different values are represented in the way that papers cover male and female actors, and different productions which have more risque approaches to tradition.
That's really interesting, because the archive's such a wonderful social history resource, isn't it, as well as theatre history?
Yeah, it really is. And it is a really wonderful resource in terms of Exeter's artistic community, because there will be so many school children and teachers and just random members of the public who will have part of their life within that connects with the Northcott in some way, whether they've been in the children's youth group, whether they've gone to a production, whether they've taken part in one. A lot of the Devon community will be represented there.
That's right. Actually, I can count myself among their number. I didn't mention that earlier, but my connection to the Northcott started when I was 17 in 1999, making paper roses backstage. It was a great experience, and there were, you're right to mention the backstage work of the Northcote, it really felt like I, at that time, was joining a really passionate and fun community. And I think that's something that comes across a lot, doesn't it, in discussions of the theatre.
Definitely.
When people act there or even go there in the audience, they feel like they're joining a very welcoming crowd.
Everyone we've talked to has remembered it fondly.
Absolutely. And if you could just sort of sum up how you think you would like it to evolve. Is it sort of getting more online so that it can reach a larger audience, or diversifying what's there? What are your sort of hopes for the collection?
It would be lovely to get more of it online. We're never going to be able to get the entirety of the archive online. We're very lucky in that there are several of the photographers that we used to work for the theatre who've given us permission to share their images online, but there are also some that we can't track down, and so we can't use their images. It's also be really lovely just to see a more diverse range of people using the archive. As I say, the design potential and things like that would be really lovely to see local arts groups being inspired by the photographs or the design potential. It's been really interesting to see some of the work that the Northcote have done with Age UK and things like that, sharing memories and how that can help in community groups. So for me, it's really, the main point is that the archive gets used. I'm all for preserving an archive, but it can't be preserved for the sake of preservation. It has to be preserved for the sake of the people who will use it and the accessibility of that archive.
Oh, you're so right. That's a really good point. And also, I think a nice point to sort of pause on for now, because of course you'll be joining us later for questions. But I think, yes, if anyone is listening who wants to get more involved in the archive, please do get in touch, because as Caroline was just saying, an archive evolves with the support and engagement and input of the people who in fact own it, because this may seem like a private collection, but it is a public resource and anyone can go and take a look at it. And we're going to turn now, thank you so much, Caroline, and I'm looking forward to talking to you again later. We're going to turn now to members of the community who have been engaging with the archive through workshops and commissions over the past year, and to hear a bit more from them about their views on the archive. So we have Babs Tolley and Sarah Samuels. If you're there, hello.
Hello.
Hi. Hi, Babs. Hi, Sarah. So can we, shall we start with you, Babs? Babs Tolley is a member of the Resilient Women's Group in Exeter, and is working with me and with Sarah and others on new artist commissions for the theatre. So Babs, tell us what interested you about the archive and what you've discovered in it.
Well, I should apologise first, because I put down that I've been coming to the Northcote since I was 7, and I just realised it didn't open until I was 9. So we'll
don't worry. I mean,
okay. I wasn't here before then, but no, I've been involved from sort of, well, quite a few areas really, because I've been dealing with the Northcote. I've been dealing with a subject on dames. We've been dealing with resilient women, and I think I didn't go, but that they've used the archives from the costumes to look at old dame costumes, and we've been designing our own dame costumes and things like that. But, I mean, some people, you have to explain the whole process of being a dame. It's a man, and it's a sort of comic book man, and but that's been fascinating. But I and also I'm involved in a heritage group where I'm writing about Stepcot Hill and things like that, and the heritage within Exeter, which I'm fascinated by, because Exeter has such a wide range of resources, I think, in itself for the theatre, because it's such a thrilling city. I love it, but the theatre, but I am worried. The thing I don't know whether this is the right time to say it, but I am worried about missing out on people that don't normally go to the theatre.
Absolutely, and that's a really important topic. I'm just gonna. Could we just pause for 1 second? I'm so sorry, but I've been plunged into darkness where I am, and I'm going to go and try and sort that out. 1 second, please. Okay. We got keys to get out? Yeah. Okay, we're back. Sorry about that. Perils of being in a shared space.
No,
okay, Babs, you were talking about the amazing resources of Exeter.
Yes, exactly.
And actually, that's an important topic, how the theatre is connected to the city.
Yes. I think Exeter is, and I don't know whether it's as I've got older, because I didn't feel like that when I was 17 and I left it. But I think when you come back to Exeter, I think Exeter is so full of resource anyway, in its history and its whole sort of I don't want to use that word, but ambience. It's sort of. I think that if you walk around the cathedral and sort of walk on the cobbles, and realise you're walking on cobbles that somebody, walked on in 1500 or something. And the same with Stepcot Hill and that area, the West Quarter. You're living in history already. So and I think it's a shame not to use that. I think it's a shame. And also, as I was saying, I worry about when you were talking about groups like LGBTQ and the Black and ethnic minority groups. I think there should be some concern about the economic groups. The fact there is an economic group that does not go to the theatre.
That's so right.
Living in the group, so but they
yes.
think they have a perception that it's academia, and it's not an Exeter thing. Well, it is
because the Northcote's on the university campus.
Yes. I've had a couple of people since I've known I've been going to do this. I've spoken to a couple of people, and they've said they thought the Northcote belonged to the university.
Well, I suppose in a sense it does, and the university has supported it, but it's always been a slightly fraught relationship, hasn't it? I think the Northcote trying to be for the city and the university at the same time. Maybe this is a good moment to bring you in, Sarah, because you're at the university. That's right, at the moment.
Hi, I'm Sarah, and I study at the university, and I was an intern starting now. Feels like really long ago, but in 2020. I looked specifically at theatre in education and the role of young people in the archives, which was really interesting because there's a lot that goes through the years, all the way from the 1960s to present day. And I think it's quite interesting that even in the archives, as Babs was saying, there was this conflict of the theatre sort of being up on the hill and people finding it quite hard to get there. And then, this question of, again, accessibility. But in terms of theatre and education, what happened a lot of the time in sort of the 1970s, theatre and education was brought to other schools. So they had the groups going from the theatre to schools and putting on these productions about various different topics, which is quite interesting, but again relates to this idea of accessibility and who gets to see the theatre and when as well. Yeah.
Do you
And I
think
think
that,
with those-
these issues of accessibility is something that the theatre can be addressing through maybe the art commissions that we're working on together, or in other ways? How would you like to see them tackling these things? Because you're so right, they're really important issues.
I think it. I mean, I don't know, because I don't know what you've been doing or what the theatre has been doing before me, you know. But when I was at school, we went to the theatre quite a lot. But with regard to the syllabus, you know, we'd go and see a Shakespeare play or a play about some modern classic, and that was part of our syllabus, really. But I looked at when I saw the programs, I had waves of nostalgia when I saw some of the programs from pantomimes and things, and I thought, I don't remember it specifically, but I remember that feeling, you know, of going to the theatre. And I know that's changed, but I think it would be such a shame if we didn't bring in young people who haven't experienced it before, because you do get a wave of, this is different, you know, this is on my learning curve, you know. So
is that what the theatre meant for you? Like, it was a thrill?
Yeah, it was a thrill. But in those
Mm.
days, I mean, I hate to say in those days, the old woman here, but you know, we got dressed up to go to the theatre, which you don't do anymore. But I still exciting, you know, to be invited. I mean, I went to Bishop Blackall and Maynard, and it was certainly on, I think, both those schools' curriculum, you know, that we would go to the Northcote and see a production, and maybe go down that route as well with regard to our GCSEs or O levels, or, you know, towards drama. And but also, I mean, I went to the other theatres, you know, the Barnfield and things like that within Exeter. But the Northcote was always held up as a out of London, you know, pre-London trip. You know, it was sort of where productions went before they went into London. So so there was always some sort of glamour with it, you know. But
does it have the same glamour for you, Sarah?
I think so. I didn't really, because I do theatre, a little bit of it at uni as well. And I had sort of been inside the Northcote for a lecture actually, but I hadn't had much to do with it before the internship. And actually, I think the archives were a way to get me involved in it, and then I really understand the history, because eventually I actually wrote one of my essays in a module about the Northcote and my experience with the archives, which in itself I think is a way of drawing people. I mean, I'm from India, you know, I don't think like it was completely new, but I think that's really exciting, because now like I have this great connection with it, which I think the archives are great for, and also the history that's associated with it, and the fact that looking into the Northcote itself and the kind of things they used to do, and still do, were some really interesting productions, like quite ahead of their time. A couple of key ones that I thought were interesting was when they went out to schools, and the group did one about slavery and then one about pollution, which were both quite interesting because this was in the 1970s, and how much were people actually talking about this, and to have them go into schools and teach children was quite cool actually. But I think it does still have the same glamour. I mean, going out to the theatre for anyone, is especially post COVID, is something that I think people are very, very keen on.
Absolutely. Can't wait for that to come back and to be normal again. So you talked. There seems to be the overlap in your experience between Bab. You sort of came to the theatre through school, and Sarah, you've been looking at theatre in education. But obviously, you're both coming into it now as adults. Do you think that more could be done to, I suppose, in a way, expand the theatre in education initiative to adults?
Yeah, I'm not an educator, so I'm not sure what what the way is around that route. But I just remember as a child, being quite small and going to the theatre. So I think it could start quite early, and my children's favourite play was Much Ado About Nothing, and I think that yeah, exactly, they sort of understood the Shakespeare words and all sorts, and I think that all comes from going to the theatre early.
Absolutely, and I think on Shakespeare particularly, you do have to hear it spoken to understand it, don't you? And I taught English in the past, and sympathise with children who are trying to understand Shakespeare just from the word on the page. It's not the same at all. So. Did you go to the Shakespeare in the Gardens productions?
Yes, I did, and I loved them. I hate to say, but I didn't want to mention them too much because they're a bit populist, aren't they? But and we all sort of.
Well, nothing wrong with that in my book.
The whole atmosphere of things like Midsummer Night's Dream in those gardens was absolutely beautiful, and the Tempest. I remember the Tempest when we had terrible rain.
Oh, quite appropriately.
Yes, exactly. So, and the whole thing about taking a picnic and all that kind of stuff. It was brilliant. But I took both my sons to Shakespeare in the Park. So, and it's accessible then, isn't it? Because it's not up in the university, and it's in the centre of town.
So, if you were to think about the future of the collection and the theatre in the Northcote, what would you like to see more of? Is it getting out into the city, or what would be great from your point of view?
I think it needs to sort of make sure that it's mingling with the city, in some way, so that we don't lose contact with it, and it doesn't become this sort of, like I said, academia institute that nobody goes to, and only a certain select people go to. I've had people say, "Well, I don't go to the theatre." Well, hang on a minute, you go to pantomime. Why don't you go to to see something a little more serious? Or and I think it's like taking children to restaurants. They don't, until they've been and experienced it. They don't know how to behave really. So
you have to start young.
Yeah, but and also the Northcote. I seem to remember when I was younger, there was quite a few well-known actors and actresses. Well, I suppose they're all actors now. Actors that came to Exeter, that sort of brought in the crowds. I remember seeing a Little Night Music there, and I think Honor Blackman was in it, or somebody like that. And and it was just, oh, it's a name I know, So, yeah. So, but I certainly don't want to see it. I want to see it as part of the community still, rather than some aloof, institution. That, yeah.
Sarah, you were going to say something then?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. I think, catering to different people, sort of like, say, ethnic minorities, and even sort of different interests. I think theatre is often associated, of course, with arts and drama, which it is. But I also think, given from what I've seen in the archives and productions like Beyond My Control, which was about epilepsy and mathematics, I do think that, you can bring in people who would probably be like, is drama really my thing? But actually bring them in anyway. And then, of course, having people from ethnic minorities and having their voices heard, I think is something that would be really wonderful to see, and having that in the art commissions that we sort of are talking about would be great. And to have that balance, making sure that, people are seeing sort of their experiences with them in the Northcote reflected, but also, introducing them to these new avenues and ways of thinking, and which I found myself going through the archives, which I think is really, really interesting. Yeah.
Oh, tell us a bit more about that. What were the discoveries you made?
I think, yeah, so I think one, yeah, with these productions called, so one that I was really, really surprised by was in the 1970s. They did something about pollution in schools. I thought it's particularly relevant now given climate change and relating to what you talked about earlier with the whole idea of educating adults. Like I was thinking maybe you could adapt it and then show it in the theatre for in a sense of like entertainment, but also educating in some ways, and then bringing that outside into the town because I think they did they did productions at the library at some point, and then of course the Robo Garden Shakespeare plays as well, which I found very, very intriguing. And then of course they also did, which as somebody from India I found really fascinating, a play with a full Indian cast set in Mughal India in the 90s. There wasn't much about it, but to actually see that was quite cool as well. And and you've seen this kind of shift in the way young people are approached, and there was a lot of going through sort of beyond Devon as well. Again, I think taking the theatre from the hill and then moving it down to everywhere else, which I think is still going well.
Yeah, that seems to be a really strong move, and hopefully with the Northcots move into the Barnfield next year as well, that will help with that process of connecting with other city locations. And I like this idea that you're putting forward of the archive being a place where you can go to discover initiatives that happened in the past but somehow weren't carried on or might have otherwise been forgotten and could be revived. It's not the theatre doesn't evolve in a sort of straight manner, does it? Sort of cyclical, and I think you can pick up on things and take them in a different direction now, perhaps. And I hope, I think you're right. I hope that the art commissions that we're making now are going to be part of that process, because the idea is that they will combine archive material and try and co-create new works in partnership with members of the community. And is that what you're saying? I think it would be great to have more co-creation as well as taking works to show people. To have those people actually initiating things.
Yeah, I think like a lot of the archive is this one big story with a lot of like networks and different things happening at the same time, and it's so exciting because I only looked at a little part of the archive, but there were so many other interns looking at other parts. So I think there's so much material that you could sort of string up and place in the present, and then for the future. And as Carolyn was saying, using the archives as this source of inspiration, almost.
Brilliant! It is so inspiring to just dive in, and I know what you mean. There's so much there; it would take a very long time to go through it all. Babs, if you had to pick one favourite object from the archive, what would that be?
Well, my heart belongs to costumes, really, but yeah, they're fascinating and they're so well done as well. And we've been taught this week or this month by somebody who is a costume designer that, and her work is wonderful, absolutely wonderful, and the stuff that she can use that isn't obvious, to make a costume out of is. I was doing Widow. Well, I was doing Widow Twankey, which is all about, she's a washerwoman, and I got cotton wool as the soap bubbles, and she came along and said, "Oh no, use bubble wrap," and I thought, "Oh, I haven't thought of that," So she's got that sort of, that sort of mind that it goes off and finds something in her mind that she can use, and it's amazing. But so yes, a bit. I'm not very technical, so I think costumes would be it.
And Sarah, how about you?
Oh, I think that's a really difficult question because there were so many things. I think I really liked the photographs, and then the negatives as well. And just looking, there was this something almost magical about looking at these old photographs in the reading room, and just it's like you're getting this sort of still from there, from the past. And I just really enjoyed looking at them and because kind of observing the details of like what happened so many years ago, but then how it can be still relevant today.
Lovely. I think that's a really good note to pause on for a moment. We're going to take a short 5-minute break. And when we come back, we'll be talking to Keith Ludwig, curator. In the meantime, thank you so much, Babs and Sarah, for joining us and sharing those insights. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, good evening and hello again. We're coming back after a short break into tonight's event, which is the fifth in a series of heritage talks with the Exeter Northcote Theatre. We've been talking to archivist Caroline Walter about what's in the archive and the many different communities that it can serve, from designers to directors to members of the public who have good memories of going to the theatre. And we've also talked to members of Exeter community who've been working with the archive and what they would like to see in terms of the archive reaching a bigger audience in the theatre coming out into the city. And there seems to be a sort of theme emerging around how this private collection can become a really public resource. And this seems like the perfect moment to say hello to Keith, who's joining us now. Keith Lodwick is a theatre and performance curator. Hello, Keith.
Good evening. Hi.
Good evening. Would you like to introduce yourself and tell us how you and when you began working with theatre collections?
Certainly, yes. And just to say that I'm normally based in Devon, not in Exeter, but just outside. But I'm speaking to you from London tonight. I've been doing a bit of travelling. But yes, I'm a freelance curator and writer. But I had a fairly lengthy career at the Theatre and Performance Collections at the V&A. Which goes back really into the mid sort of 2000s. It was known as the Theatre Museum. And when the Theatre Museum closed, I took on a curatorial role and joined the collection at the V&A, and was very much involved with enabling art to be greater sort of utilized, really, and that could be in displays and exhibitions, but certainly through the reading room facility, and also a huge amount of work was really put into digitization during this period, and I was very actively involved in digitizing the theatre and performance design collection, sort of costume design, set designs, works of art on paper, and a photographic. I think it was Sarah that mentioned that a photograph is so evocative and perhaps sometimes the only record of live performance that really exists. So it tells us so much about how something was presented to an audience. And the Theatre and Performance Collections has around 5 million photographs. So not that we've digitized 5 million, but we made a small but significant start on that collection. But in terms of exhibitions and displays, I became involved with the new performance galleries at the V&A, which opened in 2009. So although there were sort of objects such as paintings and costumes and set models and posters, there was a very strong archival collections that were put on display. I've always been interested in kind of paperwork and what they can reveal to us, and so I was very involved with that work in the collection.
And tell us more about how the collection evolved, because archives aren't a static thing, are they?
They're not, no. And our collection was the V&A's collection was it was founded in 1924, nearly 100 years old, and it was founded by somebody called Gabrielle Enthoven, who was a real pioneer. She was also a suffragette, a performer, a writer, and an avid collector. And she had amassed about 70,000 mainly Victorian playbills and programmes, which she'd housed in her flat in London. And the collection outgrew her flat. And so she spent quite a number of years convincing, a number of museums, and then finally the V&A accepted the collection, and then it joined in 1924. She continued to acquire material for her own collection right until her death in 1950. And she had a huge team of volunteers helping her catalogue her huge collection. That's always been a kind of a huge part of our story. And I think of any archive story that you have, people who perhaps have spare time and can come and really sort of engage with it and part of the catalogue process. And the collection, of course, grew and grew and grew. So it began as a paper collection, but over the years, costume, paintings, set designs, drawings, puppets, huge backcloths were all, added. And so it went from being a 2D collection into a very huge 3D collection. We also added live performance recording. We created the National Video Archive performance in 1992. And so that enabled us to film performance and archive it. So we went from VHS, of course, to DVD, and now to Blu-ray. So that is an ever-evolving way of how technology changes, really, and how people view things. And I sort of imagine that at some point there'll be a streaming, because that's, I guess, where we're going in this. So there'll be a streaming opportunity in the years to come, I think. So yes, the archive, the collections have changed immensely in the almost 100 years that have been part of the V&A.
It's a really wonderful story, isn't it? And I think it's an important one for people to hear as well, because we often tend to think of these collections as starting with the big institution or with the theatre, but it's actually about individuals like Gabrielle Enthoven, and grassroots volunteers and collectors. So
absolutely, yes, yeah. One really pioneering woman, and then grassroots volunteers. And the volunteer program was something that was, up until COVID of last year, was a huge part of our work, and we really relished having people, many of whom were often involved in the industry, and they might have been, perhaps a designer or a maker, and they would come in sometimes, 2 days a week. And help with processing and sort of cataloguing, but always had their own story of the experience of live performance. And it was always kind of wonderful for us to kind of, hear those stories and sort of capture those moments. So that they have been completely intrinsic in terms of how the archives have sort of, developed and evolved over nearly 100 years.
Can you tell us more about it? In what ways did you capture those audience memories, or the individuals' memories?
Well, I have a wonderful story. If we have a few moments.
Oh yeah.
The museum acquired Vivien Leigh's archive in 2012, and there was a huge amount of media interest. She is someone that has sort of endured in popularity over time. Because after acquiring her archive, which was very, very big, about 1,000 individual items, scrapbooks, letters, photographs, all kinds of telegrams, all kinds of material. A couple of years later, we actually acquired one of her wigs from the film of A Streetcar Named Desire, which she won an Oscar playing the role of Blanche. We had a volunteer working for us who had been a wig man, and through one of his contacts, the person that styled wig for her to wear in the film in 1950 was still alive, Gwen Franklin. She was in her 80s. When we acquired the wig, it'd been in a box for about 40 years, and so it needed to be restyled. So Gwen came in and restyled the wig that she styled in 1950. It was absolutely
the original wig that she'd made for
the
the
original
for the
wig that
film.
she had made and styled for Vivien Leigh to wear in the film. She came back and restyled it, and then we put the wig on display in the theatre performance galleries. And it was such an extraordinary story that people almost couldn't believe it. But yeah, it was Gwen's first job in 1950 at Wig Creations. And that was done through our volunteer work. So an incredible story, but all about, you know, the importance of volunteers and their connections and their stories. And then later on, the family donated Vivien Leigh's Oscar, which we also added to the gallery. So you have that moment of the wig, which is so important to us, and how it helps them transform themselves from role to role. And then the Oscar becomes sort of industry recognition. And so you had that sort of mini narrative in our galleries, which people absolutely adored.
Oh, that's wonderful. I love those stories about how one object can just sort of spiral and form other connections with so many different people. And that story really resonates with what we were talking about earlier about the importance of backstage work and makers in a theatre's history. It's not just about the performers, is it? It's also about
Yes,
a much wider field of creativity.
Absolutely. And, you know, live performance is it's a jigsaw puzzle. It's made up from so many different, and I think there's been a huge interest in the last couple of years about the making aspect, the behind the scenes people who, you know, make the shoes, make the wigs, make the costumes, paint the scenery. It's often the designer, well, usually the director, maybe sometimes the designer, that receives that kind of credit. But actually, it's more than a sum of parts. It's a whole industry behind the scenes that are really helping kind of make this kind of full performance come together. So yeah, it's absolutely fascinating, and those stories can be found in you know, makers' own archives sometimes. The museum has a full collection of somebody called Liz Reed, and Liz was she painted backdrops, and her archive has, you know, her entire documentation, has all her written notes, to the point where she would cost a project, how much it was going to cost her to have a studio, all the painting elements, anything else that she would need to kind of paint the scenery, a complete sort of A to Z of her entire process. It was absolutely fascinating.
Absolutely. Can you tell us more about how, you know, a national collection like the V&A's is connected to regional theatres like the Northcote in this sort of web of connections that we've been touching on?
That's a really great and very sort of important question. When Gabrielle Endhoven began to sort of collect the kind of the programs and playbills, they were really made up of London theatre. I mean, she lived in London, and she was actively going out and sort of collecting this material from the theatre managers, often on foot. When she was established at the V&A, she has sort of established a network of venues, and they would sort of send her, you know, first night programs, and that's what we call the core collection, really. But what we found over time, sort of, you know, from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, that, you know, lots of regional venues would get in touch, and the regional material was collected. But I think we found that over time, if a regional collection perhaps wanted to offer us something for whatever reason, often we'd very much encourage the regional venue to maintain their own archives, because the museum didn't want to be sort of London, that you have to travel to London to see, you know, a venue's collection. So we try to encourage venues to perhaps, you know, put some resource into creating an archive, housing at the venue, or maybe in the local library or another local archival resource. Because that's such important information. And I think that's come up this evening very much about how a performance venues, how their archive tells a much wider story. It's not just what people perhaps saw on stage, but it tells a story about that venue's history in the community, in the town, the village, or the city, wherever it is. It's a much wider story. And so I think it's very important that venues, if they can, retain their own material, which can, you know, reflect so much on that performance venue's place in the local community.
I think you're absolutely right. It matters most to the people in that area, doesn't it?
Oh yes, yeah, very much so, and plays a very important role.
Yes, and I think it's good to emphasize that, because you know, there has been this tendency of thinking that in order to be important, something, whether it's a theatre show or a collection, has to go to London, but that's certainly not the case, is it?
It really isn't. No. And you know, live performance venues, you know, across the UK, you know, have these absolutely fascinating histories. And yeah, as we sort of touched on this evening, tell us so much about that venue, and its local importance. And oral history, I think, has come up this evening quite a lot as well. And you know, I think, you know, Babs talked about, you know, her experience of, you know, going to the Northcote, and, you know, and how important that was, you know, for her. So yeah, it's very important.
And we'd also talked earlier, and with Babs and Sarah and Caroline, about growing the archive and the fact that you know, people can contribute to it and access it, give material to it. Can you offer any advice on that process, or what's been your experience of trying to gather material?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, Lee, and something that is hugely important to see how an archive changes and grows, and it doesn't become a static thing. And there were occasions during the time involved with theatre and performance at the V&A where we would have a range of initiatives. We would have things like an open day, for example, where we would actively write to you know, perhaps actors, designers, directors, writers, producers, makers, and have an open day where people could come. You know, it was quite informal. You know, have you know, a cup of tea. All the curators would be on hand, and we would do things, have tours, and people could then sort of see, you know, the real kind of greatness of what an archive can tell us. And quite often that would really result. So I'm very enthusiastic about the Northcote doing this.
Oh yeah, sounds lovely, especially if there's tea.
Yeah. And often, literally the next day, we would get a phone call or an email from someone, and this happened to me quite a lot. And somebody would say, I had a wonderful day. I can see the work that you're doing, and I've got a wardrobe with a costume that I wore, and it's just on a hanger. But it shouldn't really be there. It should be looked after. And it was like eureka. It was like, yes, great. This sounds fantastic. Or I've gone into the attic or the cellar or into a cupboard, and I found all my paper from that production or that venue or something that I was looking after, but I don't know what to do with it. And all those kind of moments usually lead to us acquiring a collection, and sometimes really major collections would come to us that way. So we really try to engage with our users, keep in contact with the writers and makers and designers that we were kind of building and fostering relationships with. But it really does reap results, really. So if the Northcote can do it, then I think that's a great thing to do.
Open days and exhibitions, I guess.
And exhibitions, and Caroline was talking about how often perhaps theatre programs or theatre posters really evolve in terms of design styles, and they really paint a fascinating picture of press and marketing techniques, design, and how that really reflects the era in which they're created. And I think people really respond to theatre, programs and posters. The program especially, because most of us usually retain program. It's the takeaway from the performance. So, and you can house it quite sort of easy, and they're very evocative in stimulating, memory and recall. And just a quick story, and this is something that Babs talked about, which I was really interested in. The V&A has the Redgrave family archive. Michael Redgrave, and of course Vanessa and Corinne and Lynn. After Corinne had his stroke, he lost part of his memory. When he was getting better, part of recovery was he would actually come to the archive. He would look back at productions that he was in, and that actually helped him recall the people he was performing with, the work, the venue. They really helped him recall his memory. It was actually incredibly moving, actually, that they really
yes.
helped.
What a poignant story is the archive as another memory.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yes, yeah. Recently I've become aware of, for people suffering from Alzheimer's or dementia, especially live music. Something we haven't quite touched upon is the importance of live music, and how that's incredibly important for setting, memory, and in emotion, because music is so emotional. You can remember lyrics from a song that you heard 30, 40 years ago, even if you can't remember what it was Monday yesterday or something. But so it's very, very evocative. So archives have this incredible role to play.
And that's an interesting point in thinking about collecting sound as well as works on paper and 3D works and so on.
That's right. Yes, kind of audio recordings of live performance that we were very active with. Oral histories, music. The museum has a huge vinyl, record, cassette, CD collection.
With all those changing technologies. Yeah.
That's right. All the changing technologies. So again, it comes back to this idea that it's not a station, that it has to kind of evolve with how technology evolves. But yes, sound, yes, so important.
And am I right in thinking that there are even some bootlegs in there?
Yes. So there are. So in the late 90s, as part of a kind of sort of campaign to try and capture perhaps what recordings there are of live performance, because as we know, it's not usually captured in any form apart from your own memory or in a program or a poster or a photograph. So there was a sort of a video amnesty that was held. So the Theatre Museum was actively engaged with theatre companies that are perhaps took, in some cases, amateur footage live performance, and it was kind of, it didn't matter if that footage was kind of a bit grainy or a bit sort of a bit wobbly or a bit handheld. It was better than nothing. It was, you know, an absolute unique record of what was taking place on stage. It was, you know, just the essence of live performance, and there was an incredible response. So yeah, directors, writers, actors would kind of go through again the attic or the cellar or the cupboard and find this kind of, you know, usually VHS recordings, and that began to build this other kind of live performance archive that we have. So yeah, kind of bootleg copies are now are an amazing resource.
Yeah, fantastic. And that's all part of that sort of grassroots collecting process that we've been talking about. Can I bring Caroline back? Caroline, are you still there? Because we've just got a question coming up on the stream. Kelly Johnson wants to ask, which stories tend to be missing in the theatre archives, and what should we be collecting now?
The stories that we've already talked about, you know, Black and ethnic minority, LGBTQ communities, and as Babs rightly pointed out, those who don't attend the theatre regularly, whether it is feeling off-put by the stature of the theatre or whether it's a financial consideration, those stories are often missing from the archive, partly because they haven't been actively collected, partly because at that time in Devon, perhaps those communities weren't so visible as they are now. But those stories are often missing, and it's something that the Northcott has tried to address. You can see in its sort of productions into the early 2000s, they become more diverse, and there have been initiatives like Play in a Pint, which was an initiative at one point to try and get people who were claiming unemployment benefit to come and see a play and have a pint and a pie, you know, for a small price. So there are some initiatives that are captured, but they are always from the point of view of the theatre. It's how the theatre has been dealing with a perceived problem in terms of attracting that audience. They're very rarely the other way round. So we're missing that second half of the conversation. And those are the types of records that we really would like to see appear.
Do you think that's something that, I know there's a current oral history program. It's just starting, I think. Am I right in saying?
Yes.
And do you think that's something that might address?
It's something that it can go some way towards addressing. But it's something that will take a lot of time to resolve, I think, and will take our action on our part to go out and seek those communities and ask if they're willing to engage, and then give them the space to engage in the way that they want to.
Right. Absolutely. And okay, so Dan Baker also wants to ask, how can we ensure young people and younger generations play more of a role in recording theatre for archival, especially with the technology now available to us? Keith, what would you say to that? Do we have to make it possible for teenagers to film plays on their smartphones, for instance?
That's a really good question, because the V&A, it was able to record live performance through the agreement with Equity. The only way that a performance could be captured if all the artists were in agreement. So director, writer, designer, set, costume, lighting, all the actors all had to agree for the performance to be recorded before we could sort of move forward. I guess there's an issue of copyright, that if the venue has created something originally, that work has a sort of a copyright attached to it. So that's quite a challenge. That's a challenging one. So I'm not sure about how the theatre would feel if the performance is being recorded on 100 iPhones. Probably doesn't satisfactorily answer your question, Dan. But one or more of the artists involved might object. But we're in the era now of YouTube and sort of artists kind of their own work and uploading that sort of material. So it's become much more demographic, I think, in the last 20 years.
Oh, that's interesting. So in the future, maybe trying to get these recordings together will be less of a struggle because they happen more naturally and easily.
We all have the technology now of recording something and uploading it. So in some ways, we've gone back 100 years. This is how the film industry began. It was much more demographic. It was more enthusiastic artists wanting to make filmed work. It becomes much more industrialized in the 20s and 30s, and becomes a film industry. But actually, we've kind of gone back to the beginning, where now really, if you want to kind of record something, performance, you can do it on an iPhone and then upload it to your own website or another's website. It's much easier than it was.
That's true. And just to come back, just because we're getting close to the end of tonight's event now, so just to come back to the overall question of what we would like to see, how we'd like to see the theatre archive evolve in, let's say, the next 50 years. How would you respond to that?
Me?
Yes, sorry. I should have said yes, please.
Well, I mean, the national collection at the V&A, as I mentioned, will be 100 years old in 2024. So nearly 100 years old. So that's been evolving, changing. Went from paper, went from 2D to 3D, and now digitization. So it's kind of gone in parallel with the developments in the wider world and wider sort of culture, and continues to change and evolve. So perhaps that is a microcosm of that collection. It sounds like it has the same type of materials, and it probably will continue to evolve in more sort of digitized, perhaps, fashion as those become sort of easier and simpler, and perhaps live streaming and that kind of thing.
Absolutely, yeah, and actually that relates to Kelly's point that's just come up in the stream here about maybe young people can help to decide what gets to be archived. In a way, it's unpredictable the way it's going to go, but what's clear, and I think this has come out really strongly tonight, is that it depends on the local community. And
yes, absolutely. Yeah, young people can definitely have a say in how its future, because they will inherit it.
Yeah, there's some really lovely representations from young people in the archive, particularly in terms of where they've come on a school trip and the whole class has done little thank you cards to the cast and things like that. So it's not always that they have to be directly involved in recording things for the archive. It can be that in terms of how they respond to the theatre, that those items become part of the archive, and therefore their response is part of the archive as well. I'd love to see the relationship between the archive and the theatre carry on the circular nature that we've been developing through this project, in that the theatre is creating the archive and the archive is informing the theatre, and it goes on and round and round. Yeah, it's not, an archive isn't static, a theatre isn't static, and both can learn from each other.
That's a really important point, and I think a perfect point to end tonight's discussion on. And you know, we can't predict the future, but it's certainly going to be exciting. So thank you so much to Keith and Caroline, and to our panelists Babs and Sarah as well. And all of you listening, please get in touch, come and see the archive if you haven't already. Tell us what's in your cupboards and attics and on your smartphones, and get involved. I think that's been the real takeaway from tonight's discussion, that archives are the product of the people who use them and who love them. So thank you very much to everyone speaking and listening, and goodbye from us.
Thank you.
For
Thank
now.
you for asking me. Thank you very much.
Thank you.